Hello. I asked you a couple days ago to send me some raw pictures because I wanted to make a second edition of this video that I made 2 years ago called I Edit Your Photos. And you sent in quite a few. I got a little hit by a lot of emails. But anyway, just kidding. Thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate that. So many of you actually sent in some photos and I had a lot of fun editing them. However, I'm not able to edit all of them because it's just a bit too many. I've gathered quite a few and this is part 1 of 2. So I've split up the photos that I've chosen into 2 parts. I think 18 photos each. And so this is part 1. Let's go into Lightroom and check out the photos that you sent me. So I've chosen a total of 36 photos, that's 1 roll of film, of which 18, so half, I will edit in this video and the other half in part 2. Let's begin with this wonderful photograph by Tiago Mateus. By the way, I'm really not sure with the pronunciation of some of these names, so I apologize for any mispronounced names. So when it comes to this photo, how on earth did you get this light? It looks like a foggy night with an RE HMI light to make a night scene for a film, but I can't imagine that you were walking around with one of those. Anyway, I always start off with the basic settings. One of the most important settings I always edit first is the white balance, so that I can define for myself what kind of direction I want to take the shot. In this case, I liked the cold look a lot, but still warmed it up a wee bit. Then I edited the tonal values. The shot was way too contrasty at first, so I did the usual treatment of decreasing contrast, lifting shadows, etc. And then I moved on to these 3 settings where I decreased everything to give the photo a softer and foggier look. Lastly, I added vibrance and saturation to bring out the colours a little more. Then let's move on to the curves, where I made this slightly weird curve, but essentially it's just an S-curve to bring back some contrast in a controlled manner. Then, to enhance the colours and the mood, I did something I basically do with all of my photos, and especially here it is very fitting, that is adding some teal to my shadows with the red curve. Then I used the blue curve to add a little bit of yellow to the mids, just to warm some parts up a little. The colour tab I left untouched, because there wasn't really anything I wanted to change. Something I did want to edit though are the colour wheels, where I added some teal in the mids, some blue in the highlights to further cool off the right side of the photo, and lastly some yellows in the shadows so that the photo doesn't become too cold. Next I added 2 masks, one in the middle to brighten that part ever so slightly, and then I added just a wee bit of cold blue into the upper right part of the shot, because I wanted the warmth that I added to mostly just affect the ground. And that is basically it. To finish this off, I just sharpened it slightly and added some grain. Here is the before and after. I hope you like my take on this. Next up, I received a raw scan of a film photo by Jens. Let's go ahead and convert this using Negative Lab Pro. So here is the initial conversion by Negative Lab Pro. This is such a beautiful shot, there's really not much to do here. I reset the white balance and warmed up the shot a little. For the tonal values, I just brightened it up a little bit and then darkened the shadows to not lose the contrast. I decreased Lab Glow and Lab Fade slightly to bring out some more details and then just lightly pushed the colours to this warmer green look. Lastly, I just sharpened the image and that's it. I could do one more thing, and that is clean up the dust with the healing tool, but I left them because they aren't that distracting and also I was too lazy to remove them. So here is the before and after of the positive. Next up, I've got this great shot by Kaustubh Patel, who wrote that this shot was shot on his phone, which seems to be able to shoot RAW, and so luckily there was enough data to really bring out the best of this photograph. So as always, I started off with the basics and did pretty much my standard process, which means decreasing contrast to save information and gain control over the tonal values. Also, I set the white balance to a pretty warm setting, seeing as that seemed to be the mood of that day. Also, again, I softened the shot, added more haze and increased vibrance and saturation. Next, in the curves, I made this shape, which basically brings back some contrast and slightly lifts the blacks, which adds to the hazy look. Then I adjusted the bottom and the top of the red curve to add some teal into the shadows and some red into the highlights. And again, I made this adjustment to the blue curve to add some yellow. The colours are again left unedited, and I skipped right onto the colour grading tab, where I added some warmth to the mids, some hotter orange colour in the highlights, and a little bit of teal in the shadows. And then to fine tune the photo, I added a few masks which just darkened or brightened a few parts to support and enhance the lighting in the shot. Lastly, I finished this off with some sharpening and grain again, and here is the before and after. I hope you enjoy it. Now, it's time for another analog photograph. This negative is by Joshua. Let's go ahead and convert this. So here is Negative Lab Pro's first interpretation. First thing I want to do is again reset the white balance. Then I decided to overall warm it up a little bit. Then I tried to recover some shadows to increase the dynamic range a little, and then played around with the tonal values to get just the right exposure and contrast for my taste. And lastly, I adjusted the colour for each tonal range to keep the warm look but recover some of the grass's green colour. And that is it. All that is left to do, again, is to clean up the dust, which this scan has quite a lot of, but again, I don't think I need to show you that process. Next up, let's edit this cool photo by Bikalpa Panta from Nepal. Now, I'm not sure at what time of day this was shot, but the white balance needed quite some work done. Then I did the basic treatment, just like in the previous shots, except that, for a change, I actually increased the dehaze slider, because that more popping look suit this subject better. In the curves, I then made this curve, which basically doesn't do much to most of the picture except the shadows, which are darkened. Also, I just slightly faded the blacks. The red curve I again used to add some teal into the shadows, and the blue curve to add some yellow to the mids. Now this shot, for a change, I actually did want to adjust the colours a little, because we got both skin tones and greens, which are interesting to edit. To get the result I was looking for, I edited the primary colours in the calibration tab a little to shift the yellows slightly towards green and the greens slightly towards teal. The main change, however, I then did in the colour tab, where I used the yellow and orange settings to adjust the skin tones and the green sliders to get the greens just where I wanted them. I pushed the greens further towards aqua, darkened them and desaturated them. Then I did some light colour grading with the wheels to add some warmth to the mids, some hotter warmth to the highlights and some more teal to the shadows. Next, I added a couple masks just to darken the sides and brighten the middle. Lastly, I again sharpened the image and added some grain, and that's it. Here is the before and after. I hope you're happy with the result. Next, we've got this neat shot by @ToneWarn on Instagram. In the basic adjustments, I warmed the photo a little bit and decreased the overall contrast as always. Also, I slightly darkened the entire shot, softened it a bit and added some dehazing, because here too I thought a more stronger popping look could be pretty cool. In the tone curve, I brought back the contrast with the pretty much most basic S-curve. Again, I added teal to the shadows and some yellows to the mids. Here too, I wanted to do some colour editing, but adjustments in the colour tab were not necessary. Instead, I did everything in the calibration tab, where I basically just made the greens a bit more aqua. Then further colour adjustments I did with the colour grading tool, which I used to add some reddish warmth to the mids, some yellowish warmth to the highs, and some deep blue to the shadows, which basically gave the sky this rich blue colour. Lastly, as always, sharpening and grain, and that is the finished result. Here is the before and after. I hope you like it. Next up is this shot by Herman Aguirre, who, by the way, is an OG of the channel and was part of the first edition of this video that I made 2 years ago. By the way, I hope I pronounced your name correctly this time. So he sent me some wonderful shots from some foggy days and some rainy days, and I decided to edit this one. First up, I cropped the shot to this wide cinemascope aspect ratio, which I think suits the scene so well. In the basic adjustments, I actually didn't touch the white balance and went straight to the recovery process of decreasing contrast. Also, I brightened and softened the photo and added a good portion of haze, but brought down the blacks a little to not lose the contrast from the haze. Then, in the curves, I didn't do much actually, just a soft S-curve and some teal in the shadows. The color tab and calibration tab remained untouched. I only did some color grading. I added some teal in the mids and a strong red in the highlights and some blue in the shadows. Then for some fine tuning, I made a mask and brushed over a couple highlights, which I boosted a little. Then I made another mask and brushed over some shadows to further darken them. And lastly, I brushed over the building in the background to brighten it up a little, because I wanted it to be a bit more visible. And then I just finished it off with some sharpening and grain again, and this is it. Here is a before and after. I hope you like it. Next, it's time for another film photograph. This is by @goodbye-to-light. Here is the initial conversion, which looks alright, but maybe a bit too bright and airy. First up, I reset the white balance and shifted everything towards blue and green because the photo was looking a bit too warm. Then I used Lab Glow and Lab Fade again to bring out a little extra detail, and then added some contrast by bringing the shadows down and slightly pushing up the highlights. Also, I adjusted the overall brightness to be a little darker. Lastly, I wanted to adjust the colours a bit. I added some cyan into the shadows to bring back the green in the grass. I added a tiny bit of yellow and red to the highs and a little bit of yellow and cyan to the mids. And that's it already. Here's the before and after. I hope you're happy with this version. Then here's the next shot. This is from Martin Francois, who sent me this really cool looking portrait with some playful lighting, but also kind of epic looking lighting. In the basics, I did what I mostly do, except for the highlights, which I usually decrease, but here I actually increased them to boost the red line. Then I adjusted the contrast to my liking in the curves for this really dark look, but without losing too much information from the subject's face and the light. I also slightly faded the blacks, and of course I added a splash of teal in my shadows. The color tab I skipped and only made very small adjustments to the colors in the calibration tab, making sure that the red really has this popping red hue and doesn't slide off to orange. For a change, I barely did anything in the color grading tab. I only added a tiny bit of teal in the shadows. But that was it then. Apart from sharpening and grain, all I did then was add one mask to the red line to brighten it a little and decrease the texture, clarity and dehaze to make the line a bit more glowy and softer. Here is the before and after. I hope you like the result. Next, I have this wonderfully foggy shot here by Kevin Piatek that reminds me of the kind of moods I often enjoy shooting. On these types of photos, my editing is usually on the lighter side. Here, I warmed it up a bit with a white balance of 4400 and then darkened the image. Of course, I softened it and added some saturation. One big surprise was that I actually used the dehaze slider to really dehaze the image. Normally, I enjoy enhancing the fog and pushing it further, but this photo was so foggy that I was beginning to miss the silhouettes in the back, which I didn't want to lose though, so I dehazed slightly. In the curves, I just darkened the mids a little and then added teal to the shadows and yellow to the mids. And apart from that, I actually only added some more color in the color grading tab. More yellow in the mids, some blue in the highs, and some greenish yellow in the shadows. The fun thing with these foggy shots is that you can mostly edit the colors as you please to a pretty strong extent. A dark blue look could have also worked quite well, for example, but for this one I felt more like doing this subtle green look. Here is the before and after. I hope you enjoyed the result. Next up, I got this great portrait by @Nico_NVF. I really liked the soft feel of the lighting through the glass, and so I based my edit off of that soft feeling. First, I warmed it up a little, and then I did my basic decontrasting treatment and also brightened the photo. As usual, I decreased texture, clarity, and dehaze. In the curves, I made a slight S-curve to get back some of the contrast again and used the other curves to add teal to the shadows and yellow to the mids. I skipped the color tab, but did do a little color editing in the calibration tab where I just made some changes which effectively bring out the yellows just a little more, but it's really subtle. Lastly, I went to the color grading tab and added orange to the mids, a slightly more yellow orange to the highs, and a little bit of blue to the shadows. One more thing to finish this edit was masking. I made two masks, one to pull back the exposure on the upper right corner and one to boost the highlights on the left. Finally, I added sharpening and grain, and this is my final result. I hope you like it. Then, next I have this gorgeous abstract shot by Pushkar Dayal. He described this as droplets dancing on grass. There's not much I want to do here, just boost the colors a bit and add contrast to make the droplets glow more. So in the basics, I brightened the image, boosted the highlights and pushed down the shadows a little more. I increased vibrance and saturation. In the curves, I added a pretty strong S-curve, but with an especially strong increase of the highlights, which effectively brings out the droplets even more. Then I added a little teal in the shadows and moved on to the color grading tab, where I added some orange to the mids and blue to the shadows. And that is it already. I added sharpening and grain, and here is the before and after. I hope you like it. Next up, I have this dark blue photograph by Jakim Tolar, and this is pretty much the mood I'm going to keep, but it's a bit too blue and too dark for my taste, so let's change that. I brought up the white balance to 8000 and then decreased the contrast as usual, plus I brightened the shot a little. I softened the image and boosted the haze by decreasing the dehaze slider quite strongly. Then in the curves I made this slope which mostly just darkened the shadows a little, and then I added teal to the shadows and yellow to the mids. That is already pretty much what I did, there's not much left. I used the calibration tab to slightly shift the blue primary so that we keep the blue looking blue and not let it slide off to teal too much. Apart from sharpening and grain, I only added one more thing, which is a mask at the bottom to warm up the slope in the foreground. Not that it makes a big difference though, the photograph is still very blue. But I think it looks pretty good now, for my taste at least. I hope you like it too. Then it's time for some street photography. Here's a shot I received from @SaiPhoto. It's a neat reflection photograph of a guy standing next to a road. When I saw this, I felt like a sunnier but warmer and possibly more green look would suit this, so I got to editing. First, let's warm this up with the white balance slider and bring down the tint to embrace the green. Then the shot seems a little overexposed, so I tried to recover it by bringing down a lot of values. Of course, as always, I softened the shot and increased saturation. For a change again, I actually dehazed the shot slightly because the glass was hazing the image up a little too much. Next, in the curves, I made this S kind of curve, but a very dark version of it, which pushes down the shadows and mids to bring back some contrast. And then I just added some teal and yellow again. However, in the red curve, I also added a little bit of red to the highlights to give them that sunny, warm vibe. However, this alone was not going to do it, so I got some help from the color grading tool, which I used to add some orange in the mids and some yellows in the highs. And that gives us the end result. I added sharpening and grain as always, and here is the before and after. I hope you like it. Then, next I have this fantastic shot by Kim Daniel Vidal, who seems to have been on a snowy adventure during sunrise. The snow and this light go together so well, so I shall try to bring that vibe out as best as possible. I warmed up the shot to embrace the warmth from the sunlight, and then decreased the contrast slightly, less than usual, and brightened the photo. Additionally, I did some softening, some hazing, and some saturating. Then in the curves, I brought back some contrast with an S-curve. In the red channel, I added some teal to the shadows and red to the highlights to enhance the pinkish glow. In the blue channel, I did not add yellow for a change, but instead went the other direction and added some blue to keep some of the cold tones in the shot. I didn't touch the color tab or the calibration, only the color grading wheels, where I added some blue to the mids, some reds to the highlights, and some green to the shadows. I added sharpening and grain, and then there was only some fine-tuning left to do. With the help of masks, I brightened the bottom half a bit because it was becoming a bit too dark down there for my taste. And to enhance the color contrast, I added a touch of blue and green. And then I brushed over some areas that I wanted to brighten and some areas that I wanted to darken. Lastly, I used the heal tool to clean up some things that I didn't want in the shot, which then leaves us with this final result. I hope you enjoy my take on this shot. Next up, I've got this dark self-portrait, I think, by @GabsToons. This actually doesn't need so much editing, I find, just some contrast tweaking and a little bit of color adjustments. I did my standard treatment in the basics and then moved on to the curves, where I used a slope which darkens the shot and slightly lifts the blacks. I added a touch of teal to the shadows in the red channel and a touch of blue in the blue channel. Then in the calibration tab, I adjusted the blue primary to push the deep blue color and avoid a teal look. And then with the color wheels, I only added some more blue to the mids. Then it's time for some masking. I added some dark gradients from the sides and from the bottom to concentrate the focus on the middle and the subject. Then I added 2 masks to the subject, one to brighten and warm the face, and another to brighten the shadows of the hair and the jacket. Lastly, I added 2 masks to enhance the lamp by brightening the highlights and decreasing the dehaze slider to underline the subtle flare. And that is it. Add sharpening and grain, and here is the end result. I hope you're happy with it. Then here I have a beautiful shot by Gabriel Obermeier with some light rays and some steam during a sunrise. All I wanted to do here now was bring out those features of a sunrise, and so in the basics tab I did my usual treatment of decreasing contrast, adding some haze and softening the shot. I used white balance and tint to get the overall color mood of the image to a warm sunrise feel. Then in the curves I added some contrast by mainly just darkening the shadows again. Also, I slightly lifted the blacks. Then I used the red channel to add a touch of teal to the shadows and a touch of red to the highlights. Plus I added quite a lot of yellow with the blue channel. In the calibration tab, I just slightly adjusted the blue primary to keep the shot yellow, not orange, although it doesn't really do much. The last steps to finalize the look of this image are the color wheels, which I used to add some yellow to the mids, some orange to the highlights, and some greenish teal color to the shadows, which gives the grass in the shade a bit more of a green look. I added sharpening and grain and ended up with this before and after. I hope you like my edit. Alright, it is time for the last photo of this episode. I received this gorgeous autumn photograph by @Mubashir with triple R. I started off with my basic treatment, but didn't decrease the contrast as strong as usually because I was enjoying the highlights crossing the road. I also warmed the image up just a little bit. Then moving on to the curves, I did a bit of a weird one here. Instead of an S curve, you could call this a W curve maybe? A very squashed W. Basically, what this does is darken the shadows and highlights but keep or even push the mids, which effectively adds contrast but keeps the mids rather bright looking, which is what I needed here. Of course, I added some teal with the red channel and some yellow with the blue channel. Then I skipped the color tab and only used the calibration tab to edit the colors. The main thing I did here is the green primary, which in combination with the small adjustments on the other primaries makes the greens greener or even lean slightly towards teal, and the yellows and oranges lean towards red, which I find, especially for autumn shots like these, can create some wonderful color contrast. Then in the color grading tab, I added some yellowish green to the mids, some orange to the highs, and some green to the shadows. That's pretty much it already. Some small changes I added were masks, one for each upper corner to darken that part of the image, and then some brush strokes to enhance the shadows in some areas of the trees, and some more brush strokes on a couple leaves where I added some more warmth and magenta tint to bring out some of the strong orange colors in that area. Then I applied sharpening and grain, and here is the before and after. I hope you like it. And that is the end of part 1. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you had a good time, and you like to see the process of how I would personally edit these photos. Part 2 is in the making and will be coming sometime soon, but that's it for this week. And thank you again to everybody who participated and actually sent in some pictures, because I do consider that kind of a vulnerable act, seeing as you're just sending in some pictures of yours that might not even be your best or something that you're still experimenting on. And I really appreciate it that you'd actually send those to me and let me edit it. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'd say we see each other again next week. Hopefully not on the floor, and until then, goodbye.